everyone. We are delighted to have amongst us Mr. Amish, who would be discussing his new book, The Legend of Suhail Dev. Amish has written some of the biggest bestsellers of the Indian book market in recent times, and he's easily one of the most popular writers of Indian mythology in current times. He's extremely loved by his readers for his unique style of writing about mythology, wherein he humanizes mythological characters and makes them accessible to modern readers. So, welcome to the live, sir.
Thank
So,
you. Thank you so much.
Would, uh, would you first want to introduce to us who Suhail Dev was? Because, as you say in your book, like not a lot of people know about him. And also tell us a bit about why you chose to write about this character.
Thank you. Thank you for this question. King Suhail Dev is probably one of the most consequential characters in Indian history that you've not heard of. Let me take you back to the 11th century. This was the time when the Turks were slowly starting to become the military superpower of the world. The Turks are originally from Central Asia, they're not from Turkey. So the Turks were the military superpower of the world from the 11th to the 16th, 17th century. They had conquered and massacred much of the known world. They didn't just come to India, the Arab world was also destroyed by them only. They attacked Europe, ethnically cleansed what was Greece and then made it Turkey. They attacked China, various other places. But there's a strange thing about their invasions into India. Mahmud Ghazni was a Turk as well, obviously. And so was Muhammad Ghori. What we're told in our history is, Mahmud Ghazni came, and then almost seamlessly after that, Muhammad Ghori came. And the so-called Islamic rule began. I'm saying it in inverted commas because the correct description of it is Turkic colonial rule. We don't call the British colonial rule the Christian rule. So why do we call the Turkic colonial rule the Islamic rule? Because it some way gives the impression that Indian Muslims were ruling at that time. No, Indian Muslims were as oppressed as the Indian Hindus at that time. The ruling elite were all Turks, who to us wouldn't have looked like Ranveer Singh or Prithviraj Kapoor or Hrithik Roshan, as Bollywood movies sometimes portray Alauddin Khilji and Akbar as. To us, they would have looked Chinese, okay, because they're from Central Asia. In any case, coming back, Mahmud Ghazni invaded in the 1020s, but Muhammad Ghori came in the 1190s. So our history books tell us there was a seamless, kind of transition. But actually 160 years is a freaking long time. The British Raj didn't last 160 years. Right? So how come the Turks did not come back to India for 160 years? At a time when they were going around massacring much of the known world. Okay? Arabs, Europe, everywhere. They didn't come back for 160 years. The reason for that is because in 1034, they ran into this man, King Suhail Dev, okay, who fought the Battle of Bahraich and defeated the Ghaznavid Turk army and killed them to the last man. He didn't leave one person alive. Okay, it was such a devastating defeat that the Turks did not come back for 160 years. Now, this is such an inspiring story. And to me, King Suhail Dev is a story of unity. That here was a leader who pulled together Hindus of all castes, who pulled together Indian Muslims, who pulled together Buddhists, created an army and fought a foreign invader. And this is a message that I think should echo to us over 1,000 years. And because the message is relevant today as well, there is a foreign country trying to invade us. I'm a diplomat now, so I will not take that country's name, but you all know which country I'm referring to. And this is a time for us to be unified. And King Suhail Dev's message is even more relevant than ever today.
I was reading up a bit on Suhail Dev, and I'm quite intrigued by the fact that there seems to be very less academic literature on him. So what were your historical sources? What are the kind of sources that you used to write this book?
No, you're very right. There's shockingly little scholarship work on him, academic work on King Suheldev, and not just on him, on various Indian heroes. Sanjeev Sanyal, brilliant economist and historian, has said that the history that's taught to us is often the history of our invaders, not our own history. And we don't study enough of our own people. We study the foreigners a lot more than ourselves. So that's one aspect that needs to be corrected. I'm hoping that interest will rise in King Suheldev, because look, it's a job of the scholars to study primary sources, written in Sanskrit or Turkic or Persian. And it's a job of storytellers to study the secondary sources created by the scholars, right? Their books, and then write stories, or articles on it. There isn't enough scholarship on him. It should be done. I will add one more point to it, though. One of the the biases that continues to remain among modern establishment historians is the privileging of texts over folk traditions. This was never the Indian tradition in ancient times. There's a lovely Sanskrit line, Shastrat Rudir Balyasi, that folk traditions, folk stories are more important than the texts. It's not that the Indians did not write texts. We wrote a huge number of texts. There are over 3 million handwritten Sanskrit manuscripts that survive till today, more than the rest of the ancient world combined. But we privilege folk traditions a lot more. The attitude of privileging texts over folk traditions is a relatively recent historic, and it came more from the West. And the Western historians themselves are revisiting this bias, because they have realized that obviously texts are written by the victors, so there will obviously be a bias, and you find many Western historians re-looking at historical interpretations and narratives based on folk traditions as well. For example, I'm in the UK. King Alfred is considered the first Anglo-Saxon king, the creator of England, as it were, right? Of cultural England. And Edward the Elder as well, his successor. There's very little, textual evidence on this. A lot of it is based on folk traditions, right? But Western historians now accept it, that we must try and analyze folk traditions as well. Indian historians, sadly, are still stuck in the British Raj era, and they have not updated, their approach. They must look at folk traditions as well while drawing historical narratives.
Did you revisit a few folk traditions for
Yes. A lot of this is based on folk traditions, and of course, like I said, I'm a storyteller. Okay, I'm not a scholar, so it's not my job to study primary sources in terms of the text of folk traditions and write a scholarly thesis. My job is to study them and write a story. And the point of a story is some philosophies or some thoughts that you want to. A story is essentially a wrapper, for thoughts and philosophies that you want to convey. So I have obviously relied on folk traditions and some texts which were written many centuries later. But my book is essentially a fictional interpretation of those events. I hope scholars will take up this subject and study it a lot more.
Coming to the way you write, even in your previous books also, like I'm very fascinated with the kind of descriptive accounts you give of historical or mythological episodes, very, very dramatic descriptions. How much of it is drawn from facts and how much of it is fictionalized?
Difficult to draw an exact percentage here, but if you're forcing me, I would say maybe 51.3% is fact and 48.7% is fiction.
So, but even like I'm also quite interested in understanding how do you come up with these descriptions? The way you say about how Shiva turned blue, and you're giving a reasoning for it. Like, is it imaginative or is it based on some kind of literature?
They are interpretations of literature, but it's honestly, if you speak to any. I never claim that my stories are the truth. I never claim that. I've always said only Lord Shiva knows the truth. This is my truth. This is my interpretation. Only Lord Shiva knows the absolute truth. And I guess what I'm trying to do is put up, in my mind, some plausible explanation for texts as I would have read them. So, for example, the Rig Veda has a wonderful hymn called the Hymn of Keshan. Right? Keshan, as you know, if you know Sanskrit, is the long-haired one. And if you read the Hymn of Keshan, it's almost and to any Shiv Bhakt, it appears like Lord Shiva is being described, right, out there. That his fame spreads from the Western Sea to the Eastern Sea. That's what we used to call the Arabian Sea and Bay of Bengal in those days. And that he's clothed in the sky, which means he's not anything. His walk is charismatic. It's like Lord Shiva is being described. But the interesting thing is, the last few lines of that hymn. It says, "And Keshan sat and drank poison." Lord Shiva did that. Keshan sat and drank poison with Rudra. It says with Rudra, right? Which is very interesting. So my interpretation of that, could it be then, therefore, that perhaps Lord Shiva and Lord Rudra were two independent individuals, and we have their stories have got merged. Now I don't know if this is the truth, but it's the interpretation that came to my mind, and therefore that's what I put into my books, that Lord Rudra was the Mahadev before Lord Shiva. Once again, I don't know if it's the truth. Only Lord Shiva knows the absolute truth, but this is kind of my interpretation.
Okay. So your previous books have all been on mythological characters, and again, this probably in this book you're saying that this is a historical character. But would you categorize him as a historical character or a mythological character? Because a lot of historians might say that this is more of a fictional, mythological character, the character of Suhail Dev.
I'll let historians say what they want to say. In my mind, look, this is mythology and history. This debate is a silly debate that we have taken on from the West, because the West is obsessed with the truth. Because if you don't know the truth, you're going to go to hell, and you'll suffer for eternity. I mean, it's a very childish approach to things. One of the things that our ancestors used to say is that the only subject which can lay a claim to the absolute truth is mathematics. Okay, because in mathematics, 2 plus 2 is 4, 2 plus 3 is 5. There is no observer bias. There's no interpretation. Right? That is absolute truth. So one of the reasons why the ancestors used to say, Galileo said, for example, that maths is the language in which God wrote the universe. Right? In every other subject, there is no absolute truth. There is your interpretation. Right? There is your truth, because it is guided by your observer bias. Theoretical physicists also accept that right now. There is the theory of the parallel universes, and the universe that we see as the real universe for us is defined by our observer bias. So if you see it from this perspective, then this entire debate between mythology and history is a little childish, because mythology is like the mature adult which accepts that this is my truth because I don't know the absolute truth, whereas history is like the little child which wants to insist that my truth is the truth and you better accept it. So if you see it from this perspective, I would much rather, fine, if we are speaking in English, we can use mythology, history, but in Indian languages, in Sanskrit, for example, we don't say, we don't have words for like, we don't say mithya, and all these texts are all itihasa, right? Thus it happened, right? Itihasa doesn't translate exactly as history. Right? History, as you know, is his story. That's where it's a misogynist word. So maybe it should become her story or something. Whatever. But in Sanskrit, it is itihasa, right? Which is the term used for the Ramayana and Mahabharata as well, which is the term used for history as well. I like that interpretation. And again, I'm not claiming it's the absolute truth. Leave that to the scholars to figure out.
Anuja, can I come in here? So,
yeah,
so Amish, fascinating as always. want to ask you something that I've asked somebody else, and a historian before, but I won't reveal who right now. I think in India largely there seem to be two very distinct schools of thought as far as Indian history goes, and Indian history meaning as broadly as you define it. There is a left-wing sort of version of history, which is Rumila Thapar, that kind of school, more academic or whatever, academic in sort of how they define. And then there's a right-wing school of history which actually, which has a very different approach, which essentially, says that a lot of India's prime is actually behind India. It's behind us. The prime of India is actually, it's many years behind. So, firstly, do you agree with this distinction that there are two very distinct sort of thoughts of a left school and a right school of history in India? And second question is, what was India's prime, according to you?
A damn good question, yeah. I'd love to know who you asked this to later, and what was his or her answer. Look, there clearly is a left-wing school and a right-wing school of history. The academia is dominated by the left-wing side, so the right-wing guys cannot enter there. Popular history is dominated by the right-wing side, which tends to attack the left-wing guys as Marxist and biased, etc., etc. I'm not one for name calling. What I would love to see between these two schools is the Shastra tradition that we used to have in ancient India, where the scholars debate on stage in front of all of us, not behind closed doors. This peer-reviewed concept that is more from the West is a way to hard-code in elitism, actually. The finest, you'll find that the greatest amount of knowledge that has been generated often is out of peer-reviewed circles. Because remember, peer review enforces groupthink. Groupthink is never an approach to, for path-breaking thinking. If Galileo's paper had been peer-reviewed, can you imagine what would have happened?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, we, of course, Indians obviously knew that, that the sun is the center of the solar system, but for all you know, West may still have been thinking Earth is the center of the solar system. So peer review is, in my opinion, a faulty methodology that has been put in the last 100 years, perhaps. It's seen as a sign of quality. In my mind, it's a sign of elitism and often enforces groupthink, and new thoughts don't emerge. I much rather prefer the ancient Indian approach, which is open debates between the scholars in front of everyone. Right? There's this lovely book called Vada. I'd encourage you to read that by Vallabh Tripathi, no relation of mine. He speaks of the debating traditions of ancient India and how they used to happen, how they used to ensure that the debates were productive, that most importantly the debates were polite and no name calling, no insults. Satyam Bruvat, Priyam Bruvat. Speak the truth, but speak with love.
Yeah,
that generated a lot more knowledge, which brings me to my view on did India have a prime? Yes, clearly it did. If you see the work of Angus Madison, for example, in the first Millennium Common Era, for most of the first Millennium Common Era, India contributed anywhere between 30 to 35% of the world's GDP, which is a higher proportion than what the US contributes now. A lot of it, I admit, was based on the size of the population itself. But the population itself grew because of better medical standards and hygiene standards out here. Why would you have a higher population in India as compared in those days as compared to in China? Remember, China's population grew a lot later as compared to Europe or the Mediterranean world, which were as lush.
Right.
India was also the center of trade in those days. We keep being told of the Silk Route, but how much can you carry on camel and oxen, right? To do large trade, you need ships. Indian Ocean is the only ocean in the world where the winds change direction like clockwork once a year because of the monsoon winds, right? Unlike the Atlantic Ocean, Pacific Ocean. So the Indian Ocean is almost like it's designed for an annual round trip by ship, right? Because the winds change direction, right? And right at the heart of this system is India, right? Because of its geographical location. India, why do we have such huge hoards of gold and silver in India, despite not having massive gold mines in history, despite so much having been looted out by Nadir Shah, by the British? We still have such huge reserves of gold in temples, in so many places. It's because of centuries of trade surpluses. In the first millennium, Emperor Vespasian of Rome had banned trade with India because Rome was going bankrupt, importing things from India, but sending only gold strategy out here because India didn't want anything from them. Written an article on this that in the first millennium, India didn't send any armies out to conquer. We like to think that we were peaceful Mahatma Gandhis in the first millennium. We weren't. We were actually quite violent. But we were violent with each other. We didn't send armies outside our borders. Only once did we send an army, that was Rajendra Chola when he conquered Southeast Asia. But despite that, in the first millennium, more than half the world became Indianized. Right? Southeast Asia, right. They took on Hindu names. They restructured their entire societies. Right? They built Hindu.
And Sanskrit spread all over Southeast Asia.
Yeah, they took on Hindu names. Right? Then China.
But was there any conquest in that?
No, because it started at the beginning of the first millennium. The Rajendra Chola conquest was in the 10th, 11th century, 1,000 years later. Okay. Right? Japan and China became, Buddhist, and Buddhism got, kind of melded into the warp and weft of their core cultures. Turks became Buddhist. Right? Turks converted to Islam quite late, only around the 11th century. The Turkic word for idol is Bud, which actually comes from Bud. Okay, so even till today, many Turkic languages, not in Turkey, I'm talking about Central Asia, have a high proportion of Sanskrit. All this happened in the first millennium. Why did they do this? Because in those days, becoming Indian raised your status, just like today becoming American raises your status, right? You find so many people who walk by the US embassy in Bandra and suddenly develop an American accent, right? Because they think it raises their status, or they'll want to Americanize their name, call me, I don't know, Mike, not Mukesh, or Peter, not Protin. You've seen that happening. Why? Because becoming American raises your status in today's day. So India was hugely successful in the first millennium. Again, this has not been studied enough because our history is more a study of our invaders than our own study. But having said that, I don't like, there's a certain group among the right wing which is obsessed by the history so much that they're just getting lost in it. And I don't think the greatness of our ancestors has to be a balm for our present failures. It should be a fuel for our future greatness. Right? We should get inspired by what they were kick-ass guys, man, our ancestors. They achieved huge amounts, right? Knowledge, trade, warfare in every way. They were so liberal. We were like the America of the ancient world. We would give refuge to Jews, to Parsis. I mean, when Zoroastrian Persia was destroyed by the Arabs, we were like the America of the ancient world. So we should use that as inspiration and make our future even greater. I've always said this. I've said this in, it sounds much better in Hindi. But I'll say this, that that when our ancestors look down on us, they shouldn't feel from the heavens. They shouldn't feel shame. They should feel pride. Okay, and that's what we need to do to build our future. How do we make our ancestors proud of us, rather than our ancestors thinking, "Sale, ye gadhe hamare vanshaj hain." Kuch nahi achieve kiya hai.
So you said some very interesting things, but I want to focus on two things, right? One is, you did say that there are two distinct schools of history in India. One is the left wing and the right wing, and the left wing academia is is basically left wing history. Is that a fair statement?
It's dominated by them. It's difficult for someone with a different point of view to make an entry there. It's not just in India. Academia across the world is dominated by the left wing, which as a centrist, I would suggest you need all opinions. You don't just need diversity in the gene pool. You need diversity of thoughts as well.
Yeah. So I'm not trying to push you to make a political statement, but I want to know: do you believe that therefore our history that's taught in schools needs some relooking at, and some more right-wing influence?
Dude, I'm a believer of our ancient way. Okay. In our ancient way, there was no concept of blasphemy. There's no translation for the English word blasphemy in Vedic Sanskrit. So I believe that even the gods and goddesses are not beyond question.
Right.
So then why not question Romila Thapar and Ben Jha? I mean, anyone is, or anyone on the other side. No one is beyond question. No one. And greater knowledge only comes when you're willing to question. Right. And boss, we are a culture which doesn't, I'm repeating again, we don't even think the gods are beyond question.
Yeah.
Mind academics.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so the other thing I wanted to ask you was, you mentioned protectionism, that Greece started getting protectionist in its trade policies with India. At what year did you mention that was? Second, third year?
Of Rome. Emperor Vespasian. Emperor Vespasian would have been, I guess, 2nd, 3rd century, Common Era. 2nd century, I think. So
the protectionism and deglobalization, which is happening all over the world now that we are seeing, is not new. I mean, what is there a period of time, a playbook that you think we could look at?
History doesn't go in cycles, I think. History goes in kind of like a sine curve, right? It goes like this, right?
Yeah.
So if you see, I think even globalization, there are rising phases, there are dominant phases, and then there are declining phases. And there are many, often massive changes are driven by natural disasters, which people don't understand. Like the Arab conquest of much of the world was preceded by the Justinian plague, which weakened, the Roman Empire, Eastern Roman Empire, and Zoroastrian Persia, and of course, the Roman Empire and Zoroastrian Persia had exhausted each other fighting, endless battles. I think it was a 30-40-year war. So they were completely exhausted, and then the Arabs suddenly emerged. And when the Arabs rose, it began a new era of globalization, right? Because there was the era of globalization. I'm talking about the West, not India. The Indian Ocean was largely globalization dependent on the strength of India. If India was strong, it was globalized. The trade routes were protected because Indian Ocean trade routes were till the 17th, 18th century. Whoever controlled the Indian Ocean trade route was the richest land on earth, right? And when India was strong, we used to protect the Indian Ocean trade route. So there was heavy globalization among the Indian Ocean rim. Western historians tell us that sub-Saharan Africa was never developed, which is a load of bullshit, actually. There were great cities out there as well in the first million. Great Zimbabwe, for example. A lot of it was trade-driven, right? So Indian Ocean rim had its own sense of globalization, depending on India's relative strength. As India declined, and many of our Turkic invaders, they were from Central Asia. They weren't really traders. They didn't understand ships too much, frankly. Neither what we call the Delhi Sultans or Mughals were actually Turks, right? They didn't call themselves Delhi Sultans. They didn't call themselves Mughals either. They called themselves Temuriya, the Mughals. So descendant of Temur. So they weren't really good at seafaring. So therefore, India kind of retreated, and that had its own issues. In the West, it was essentially driven by the Mediterranean world, right? When Rome declined, then that obviously had its own issues. So there are these, periods of up and downs, often driven by tragedy or some massive change. So is the present era of globalization coming to an end? Perhaps it is. Perhaps it is. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong. It's just it's just the way it is.
Yeah.
Because there were some losers in the era of globalization. There were some winners. I mean, India and China were certainly winners. The middle classes in the West were certainly losers. The elites in the West certainly benefited. Middle classes were hollowed out. It's a reality. But India, China benefited, no doubt.
And is there a story from our itihas that you can point us to give some context to what's happening on our borders with China today?
We've never had a border with China. for most of human history.
Yeah.
Uh,
So our relationship with the
till-
with that part
till
of the
they-
world.
till they took over Tibet. And our relationship with them was often driven by trade and religion, where India exported a lot more than imported. It's not that Chinese culture ever came to India, but Indian culture certainly went to China. Kung Fu actually has its roots in Kerala. The Buddhism that went there probably went with Avalokiteshwarji, right? Who had his own interpretation, and it spread. You find Chinese and Japanese interpretations of Lord Kuber or Goddess Saraswati or Lord Ganesh in their lands as well. So you found many Chinese visitors coming here. Most famous of them, Hyun Sang and Fa Hin, because they wanted to come to the land of, they believe, their cultural ancestor, Gautam Buddha. Till as late as the 18th century, it's very interesting. If you see Japanese maps, India was still the center of the world for them. The maps, you notice how in most countries, like if you're in the UK, UK will be the center of the world. The rest of the world will be to the west and east. India, for example, the government map still today has UK in the center because we are still colonized. We still have UK in the center and the rest of the world to the west and east. Indian maps as well. Japan till the 18th century used to have India at the center, the rest of the world to the west and east. So it shows the tremendous influence we had in those countries. It's only now that we are engaging directly, because Tibet was taken over.
No, in fact, I think America goes one step further. The size of the American continent is actually exaggerated in the American map, I believe.
Yeah, it is. No, it's also because of the Mercator projection, right?
Right.
In what happens when you flatten out the globe, countries closer to the equator appear smaller, countries further away appear bigger, right?
Okay.
So India is actually a lot bigger than it appears. Africa is massively bigger than it appears.
Yeah.
In the Mercator projection, because when you flatten the map out, and England appears huge relatively, it's even smaller, or Russia appears far bigger than it actually is. It's a Mercator projection.
So I'll just again try to get a lesson from Itihas for the audience. Really unusual times we're facing. There's fear of disease all over the world at the same time. There's incredible economic uncertainty that just doesn't seem to be going away. Is there a lesson from Itihas for us that we can look at right now that will actually help us through this time?
I think damn good question. And I think there is. Look, the reality of the world today is it's very easy to criticize the leaderships in all countries. But the reality is, in living memory, these are such unprecedented times. It's very difficult to plan for this. It's very easy for people, critics to say, why didn't this leader plan that? Why didn't he plan that? Because no one has imagined a world where the entire world will actually literally shut down for 3 months. This has never happened in human history. We've had pandemics before. Yeah. But our reaction to this pandemic is unprecedented. At no point of time in human history has the entire world literally shut down for 3 months. Right? So this is unprecedented in every way. Right? How can you even plan for what to do? Like, in the first few days of the lockdown in the UK, I'm in London, we weren't getting eggs here. Okay. And you know what the problem was? And how do you even plan for this? Because there are enough poultries out here. Okay.
Yeah.
And they had the big cartons, the stuff which goes to restaurants, were manufactured in the UK. The small cartons, the retail ones, are actually manufactured in France. Right. And they used to come here. Who knows these details? Right. And when the lockdown happened, suddenly those cartons aren't available and you don't have eggs for 2 weeks. And people are criticizing, what is the government doing? But the modern economy is so complex. Nobody knows every single detail. So in this kind of scenario, which country will emerge stronger in this. Not necessarily the country which is the richest, not necessarily the country which has the most powerful army, because it depends. So many things can go. I think it's the country which at its core culture is gritty. Okay, which, you know, it's I heard this wonderful line. Many of us like to think we are in the same boat, the entire world. No, we are not. We're in different boats. We're just in the same storm, right?
Right.
And each of our boats has its own different trajectories, and no one can predict what wind will come from where.
That's a very interesting metaphor. Yeah.
Yeah. And no one can predict. And no one can predict what your country will specifically face. Boss, we had this COVID pandemic. We had the worst cyclone in recorded history coming up our east coast. We had a cyclone coming on the west coast. When has that happened? Right? We had locusts. What the hell is going on? Right? China is having its worst floods in history actually right now. I don't know how many of you have been tracking it. There is a fear that the Three Gorges Dam might actually crack. Right? Can you just imagine the devastation? Right? You can't plan for the kind of things that are happening. Locusts, you know, two cyclones. How do you plan for all this? Right? I think the only countries that will emerge stronger, the cultures that will emerge stronger out of this are those that are gritty. That we can take blows, but we will not surrender. हम लोग लड़ते रहेंगे साले. That culture will succeed. I think India is unbelievably gritty. Okay. I know we like to think we're weak and that we lost every battle in the last 1,000 years. That in my mind is a load of bullshit. We did lose battles, but we won many as well. You know, one of them was the Battle of Bahraich. No, never lose a chance to mark it. Legend of Suheldev. Great book. Check it out. Okay. We won many battles as well. We are the only Bronze Age culture that is alive till today. Every other Bronze Age culture has been wiped out, most of them violently. Okay. Why? Because most of them surrendered. Zoroastrian Persia, I've said this often, one of the greatest empires of its day, survived just between 30 to 50 years when the Arabs attacked. That is it. They surrendered. All their temples were destroyed or burned to the ground. Their universities were burned to the ground. They found refuge in India. The few who are alive are in India because India gave them refuge. But 1000 साल हो गए साला हम आज तक जिंदा है, हम आज तक खड़े हुए, because we are gritty. Okay, we are tough buggers. So and you notice that our resistance never stopped in this last 1,000 years, right? When the North lost, the Hariyar Bukharaya rose, Vijayanagar Empire. When they lost, then the Jats rose. When they lost, then the Ahoms rose. When they lost, the Marathas rose. Then the Sikhs. We never gave up. We are a very, very gritty country, which is why I am optimistic about India. Because we don't know what will come, but we know we are tough enough to handle it.
Can I just push that when you say, you're saying gritty as a culture? One of the things I find about India, and I've been told I'm wrong, is that we have an equal amount of respect and disdain for wealth. That idea of wealth creation being at the center of our society. So I think in India it isn't the case. Most countries define that how hungry are you for wealth is as a big sort of driver of ambition, growth, success, whatever. Do you agree with that thought? Or
I agree to an extent, and I think it's it is a legacy of our economic and educational mistakes for the post-independence, where we privilege socialism. I'm a pragmatist, and I think there's something to be learned from every ism. Okay,
yeah.
Every religion, every way of life has something to teach, and we must try and learn. The only ism that I'm a very, very strong opponent of is communism. Every single country where it has been tried, it has been an unmitigated disaster. It has destroyed countries left, right, and center. Black Book of Communism, 100 million people have died thanks to communism. It is the most murderous ideology of the 20th century. And we in our education, we have privileged socialism. Our movies, and this in my mind has led to a very negative attitude, which needs to be combated. Right? I'm not a fan of unfettered capitalism that creates as much chaos as well, because we are followers of goddess Lakshmi, right? So which means that we will create wealth, but in a dharmic way, not in an adharmic way.
Yes.
Which means wealth must be created in the right manner, and wealth must be used for good as well, right? For dharma, and dharma doesn't. It's not religion. Dharma is essentially the good of all 1.3 billion of us. We need to learn those. This, I think, in our popular culture, in our education, we need to openly start talking of the severe risks of communism and socialism. Every country that it has been tried in, hundreds of thousands have been killed, economies have been destroyed. It's the only ism that I constantly oppose, communism. Otherwise, I think there's something to be learned from every religion in the world. There's something to be learned from every ism in the world. And I'm usually a fan of pragmatism. Be balanced, be centrist. But this, I think, is a legacy of mistakes that we made in the first few decades. The legacy still survives. We need to fight it in popular culture and in education.
Sure. Aditya?
Yeah, sir, so since we're running a little short of time, we would like to take a few audience questions now.
Sure.
So Nishant is asking, agree with your point that we should be taught much about Indian heroes than the invaders, but in current scenario, this is labeled as jingoistic. Example, if a filmmaker makes a movie on Tanhaji or Rani Lakshmibai, then the debate of jingoism and nationalism starts. How do you react to that?
Look, it's not my style to have, but if people have, we are India, we have loud emotions, right? It's the way we are, right? And I am a supporter of freedom of expression. So everyone has a right to put their point of view across. But yes, when we study these subjects, it would be ideal if it's, especially the scholarly study, it must be done with calmness, with a sense of balance, and without extremism on either side, the left or the right. The truth usually is in the center. The ideal mean, the ideal middle. That's a part of the Indian tradition in any case, because we eschew extremism of all kinds, right? Ati sarvatra varjayit. Any form of excess, any form of extremism should be avoided. So that would be my ideal approach. Having said that, both the left and the right, they have their points of view, and I'm a supporter of freedom of expression. So I would never support ki boss, I find that, too left, I find that too right, so therefore shut it down. No, that's not my approach. Everyone should have a right to say what they want to. But what I would ideally like is a centered, calm approach to this subject. An approach which generates light rather than heat.
Okay. Vishal Sel has a question. He's asking you if there is a chance of you writing something on Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj.
I have a story idea in mind on Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj and the 30-year war. If he knows a bit about history, then he'll know what I'm talking about. Because some of the figures in the 30-year war are so inspiring. Sambhaji, Tarabai, what a woman. So yeah, hopefully, let's see. My biggest problem is I have too many story ideas for one life. So I need to. That's why I started the Writer Center. I can't die before I finish all my stories.
All right, sir. It was a pleasure to speak to you. And
if you're wrapping up, I have a last question. Sorry,
okay,
I have a last question. I can't. I struggle to hold back when Amish is here. Amish, are we? You said there's cyclones, there's locusts, there's disease, there's economic uncertainty all over the world. In India, there's war on our doorstep. Are we in Kali Yuga? How long is it going to last for? Is that? Do you read a lot into that stuff?
I'm not saying I read into it, but yes, I do read off it. The theory of the four yugas is that there's of course the Satyug, Treta Yuga, Dwapar Yuga, Kali Yuga. Right? If you read the Bhagavad the way it has been described is that the yugas exist at various levels. There's the yugas at the human level. There's the yugas at the level of the devas. There's the yugas at the level of Lord Brahma, Lord Vishnu, Lord Shiva. Right. So the length of of the yugas, 1,54,000 years or stuff that you read, that is usually for yugas, say at the level of Lord Brahma, Lord Vishnu. Right? Yugas at the level of human beings is a 12,000 year descending cycle, 12,000 year ascending cycle, okay, and 200 years of intervening periods, right? So each cycle is actually 26,000 years at the human level, right? There's a descending Satyug, descending and an intervening level, descending Treta Yuga, intervening level, descending Dwapar Yuga, intervening level, descending Kali Yuga. Then intervening level, ascending Kali Yuga, intervening level, ascending, going that way, right? So it's like a sine curve which goes this way,
right.
And that one total cycle of that sine is 26,000 years. Interestingly, 26,000 years is also the average period for the precession, the phenomenon of precession. The Earth, it rotates, right?
Yeah.
But if you've seen a top, it doesn't rotate on a fixed axis. A top normally wobbles, right?
Yeah,
While rotating.
Yeah.
So the Earth also wobbles like that while rotating, okay, and revolving, right? And that wobble is such that it comes back to its original position once every 26,000 years. So a precession cycle is 26,000 years. So it could be a coincidence, could be there's something to it, I don't know, right? So the human level of this, this full cycle of the yugas, they say that we are in the ascending Kali Yuga right now. So which means it's still Kali Yuga, but it's improving, right? Dharma is improving. This is what the theory is. I'm not saying I read into it in the modern day. I don't know enough of that subject to speak there. But one thing is clear, that this year is a time of immense change, 2020. Okay, there's this ancient Chinese curse. I'm saying that with irony. That may you live in exciting times. It's actually a curse, right? Because what do they mean by exciting times is when the entire board has been shaken up, all the pieces have been thrown into the air, and you don't know how they're going to land, right?
Yeah.
We are in that year. How things are going to land, frankly, no one knows. And all critics who are saying, why didn't leaders do this? Why didn't companies do this? No one can plan for something like this. Okay,
Yeah, of course.
No crisis scenario ever imagined the world being literally shut down for 3 months. I mean, if any critic expects that, then he's being silly, right? So this is actually an exciting quote unquote time, Chinese curse, as I said. And the world will, it's a cliche, but the world will certainly not be the same, right? It's going to change dramatically. How the pieces will land, it's very difficult to say right now. If the Three Gorges Dam actually breaks, there are 400 million people downstream. Can you just imagine? Right? Say it doesn't break, then it's a different situation, right? Who can predict these things? So it's a bit like, if I have to use that, the yugas theory, this is like one of those intervening periods. And the belief was that intervening periods have a lot of chaos, because that's what creates the new age, right?
Okay.
So this is a period of tremendous chaos. What the new age will be, honestly, we don't know. The only thing that appears to me as a sensible strategy in a time like this, be gritty, be capable of handling any shit that comes your way, and be united. Okay, this is not the time for silly, petty infighting in India. It is our favorite pastime. If we Indians are such that when we don't know what to do, we like to start fighting with each other, right? It's like, बैठे बैठे क्या करें, करना है कुछ काम, चलो infighting start करें. Okay, we are like that. We need to stop. At least at this time, please, for God's sake, stop. Silly Hindu-Muslim fights, caste-based fights, language-based fights. We need to stop all this. This is the time to be united. Then we can emerge stronger once this crisis is over. And if India is strong, then we'll be strong, right? I mean, if India sinks, all of us will sink.
Yeah.
That's my approach.
Amish, thank you so much. Advija, thank you. Please, you were going to say a
Thank
thanking
you.
piece? Or?
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, sir.
Thanks, Adreja.
It was a pleasure.
And
And congratulations on your new book.
leave without plugging my book again?
Yeah.
Check it out. It's available everywhere. Legend of Suhail Dev.